to get this place working again. And with that, Madam President, I yield the floor.
First of all, Madam President, let me thank my friend the senator from Alaska for her comments, my dear friend the senator from Virginia for his comments. And I know you've heard these same kind of stories. I'm going to somewhat echo what has already been said. But what I don't understand, and for those who are listening or viewing, four of us and many others on both sides of the aisle have been working in good faith to try to say, how do we get out of this? The question I have is I wonder if all of our colleagues have actually gone out and sat with federal workers or folks who are affected, how anyone could sit with anyone who's affected by this self-imposed personal, financial, and economic disaster and not say, let's not talk about blame, let's get the government reopened, and then we can figure this out, but let's get the government reopened. I'm going to recount some similar stories, but, and I appreciate, again, Senator from Alaska's story of the Coast Guard in Kodiak. In Virginia, we've got a major Coast Guard facility down in Hampton Roads. But it's, as you've mentioned, it's not just federal employees, it's contractors, it's private businesses, it's a host of other folks. And I hope the presiding officer is also part of the group that's been trying to say, how do we get to yes? How do we get to something reopened that maybe we can renew our efforts and urge all of our other colleagues, many of them who've gone home, that I hope they will sit down and have these kind of sessions. I don't know how anybody can look people who are out of work without pay due to nothing that they've done individually and say, no matter who is winning the inside the beltway battle of the day, that we owe it to them to get this government reopened. So, Madam President, I rise today out of deep frustration with the administration's treatment of federal workers during this government shutdown. The one thing, I'm going to come back to this again, but I wish there was some indication that whether the President, the Vice President, or any of his top advisors would actually go out and do a listening session with federal workers. That doesn't seem to be too much to ask. I want them to look those Coast Guard spouses, or those TSA employees, or those air traffic controllers in the eye and say, why are they being held hostage on an issue that frankly has nothing to do with their work as public servants. We're now on day 29. I call the President's shutdown the longest shutdown in U.S. history. In many ways, we are creating the legacy of this administration, a legacy that the President claimed in mid-December that he was proud to have initiated the shutdown that's plunging so many Americans' lives into chaos. Now, more than 800,000 federal workers have missed a paycheck. And that number, I think, the Senator from Alaska alluded to and the Senator from Virginia has alluded to, is actually a fraction of the folks who are actually being affected. That doesn't count. That's just the 800,000 federal workers. It doesn't count the countless contractors. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Or the host of businesses, the brewery in Kodiak. They're not federal workers. They're absolutely being affected. And let's recognize, even when we are reopened, those Coast Guard workers are paid back. That brewery is never going to make back its lost revenue. Now, the President has found time for an Oval Office address. He's found time for a trip to the border. He's found time for a tit-for-tat with Speaker Pelosi. But what he's not found time for, and for that matter, anybody else in the White House, to sit down with the federal workers who are being affected. And I believe that is a national disgrace. Now, again, I appreciate, Madam President, you and your colleagues listening. I know you've listened, and we are continuing to work with other colleagues on both sides of the aisle to try to hopefully find some sense in this disaster. But truth is, people's time is running out. Over the last couple of weeks, Senator Kaine and I have heard from so many Virginia families who are suffering the burden from this shutdown. And I wanted to share some of those stories. Senator from Alaska told about the story of a 13-year-old who couldn't cash a Christmas check. At least for me, I can't speak for Senator Kaine, but the most compelling story, heartbreaking story, and I'm going to tell a number, but the one that I've kept coming back to is that Senator Kaine and I had with the press, a series of federal workers tell their stories. One of the federal workers didn't want to come and do it on camera, but he came up and talked to Senator Kaine and I afterwards. He was a relatively young guy, about 35. He was a veteran. He was also an air traffic controller, and he'd now gone 4+ weeks without a paycheck. His wife had served in the Air Force in an intel capacity and was suffering from pretty significant PTSD. Because he hadn't had a paycheck, he couldn't pay the $90 copayment for his wife to continue to see her psychiatrist and continue to pay for her drug treatment. And not unlike the story the senator from Alaska told, he said he has his wife taking care of their 2 kids, 4- and 5-year-olds. And the 4- and 5-year-old kids came to their parents and brought their piggy banks and said, "Can we give you, Mom and Dad, what we got in our piggy banks to help our family?" This is the United States of America. These are 2 veterans. We say we honor their service. This is somebody who is still going to work and working overtime without pay to keep our air safe. This shouldn't be. This shouldn't be. Same time, a few days earlier, we'd met with other workers, a young father who we met who works for the Department of Justice, was unable to get his 7-week daughter. He brought his daughter to this session because when his daughter was born, he wanted to make sure he could get his daughter on his federal insurance plan. That's his right. But the person who was supposed to submit the form to the insurance company had been furloughed. So he went to the doctor, and his infant daughter had an illness and had to get a prescription. He didn't have the money to pay for the prescription, and his daughter wasn't registered on his insurance company, not because of any fault he had made, and he wasn't able to pay for the insurance. Now, in this case, thank God, the insurance company actually worked with him, and they brought extra proof and went through other hoops, and he was able to get the medicine. But how many other young families are going through that same stress right now? Eric, a federal law enforcement agent and father of 3, wrote me an email this week, and he said missing a paycheck had caused, quote, a tremendous amount of strain on his family. This is a law enforcement officer. Now, Eric said he had some money saved up in a rainy day fund, but he went on to continue to tell me, quote, it's raining extremely hard right now in terms of that rainy day fund. At some point, I'm going to have to make some tough decisions to ensure that our family has a roof over its head and a food on the table. Unfortunately, a lot of the employees we've been talking to, Senator Kaine and I, don't have that rainy day fund. One of the things I think we all knew, maybe intellectually, had all seen the statistics, that half of Americans couldn't afford an unexpected $400 bill without going into financial ruin. We're seeing that play out right now. Again, not because somebody has been mismanaging their funds, but because they expected if they worked for the United States of America, and if they were willing to continue to do that work, that they get paid. And we're into this crisis now 29 days, and if we think we've seen the stuff hit the fan so far, wait until this coming Thursday when families go through that second pay period. We're adding insult to injury. They get a paycheck that says zero, or in one case of an air traffic controller, a penny. And at the end of this month, as you get into the new month, when all their bills come due. Yesterday, I volunteered at a food bank in Arlington, where federal contractors and furloughed workers were coming because their families were running out of money. These were folks, a couple of them came up to me and said, listen, I'm kind of viewed myself always as middle class. I've been working for the federal government for double-digit years. They felt an enormous amount of kind of almost shame to come to the food bank. Now, you shouldn't feel shame to come to a food bank, but their appeal was get the government reopened. Now, the president, who's never worked for a paycheck in his life, says he can relate. He says he's sure that, quote, the federal workers will make adjustments. The very same president who has not had the common decency to sit down with any federal workers and listen to their stories. Here's what some of those adjustments look like. Lisa in Arlington wrote me an email. It says, quote, I'm forced to look for multiple part-time jobs to make ends meet, and my savings will soon run out. Creditors and landlords have only so much patience with us. Another worker, Senator Kane, and I met on Thursday, broke down and crying when she said how hard it was for her to send her infant child away up to a week to 10 days because her mom, who'd been taking care of that child, had to go up and deal with some of her own personal business, and she couldn't afford daycare. How dispiriting and disheartening, and the chair has already pointed out in terms of recruitment and retention, to say to those who are actually trying to serve others, to now suddenly see their livelihoods in jeopardy through no fault of their own. And the truth is, this shutdown is having a devastating effect, not only on the short-term morale, but the long-term morale of all our federal workforce. And the fact is, since we've already agreed to pay them when we reopen, why shouldn't we at least go ahead and, even if we are shut down, pay these federal workers come Thursday so they don't have to incur additional pain and suffering? Because the truth is, and I commend so many of us, in particular my friend the Senator from Virginia, who, along with Senator Cardin, led the effort, that we're giving federal workers back pay when we reopen. But back pay alone doesn't make up for the hurt if you've had to draw down from your IRA and have a tax penalty. It doesn't make you whole if you've taken an advance against your credit card and you've got to pay those fees on paying those dollars back. It doesn't make you whole, as, again, the presiding officer indicated, if you get dinged on your credit rating, or if you're in the process of trying to get a security clearance and that security clearance is withheld because it appears you've got bad credit, not because you did anything wrong, but because the Congress and the President can't agree on how to pay you when you're still asked to do your job. Now, the number of federal employees, current federal employees, who are eligible for retirement is supposed to be about 30% over the next few years. How many of those federal employees who we've trained and worked with, who bring enormous expertise, are not going to wait until they have to retire, but actually say, I'm going to get out of this job now? And the last thing we need to do is further undermine the competitiveness of our federal workforce. Now, heard the other day, and this is, again, you've made this point, Senator Kaine has made this point, it's not just the federal employees. Federal contractors. Heard from one federal contractor from Ashburn who says the shutdown, quote, has rocked the financial stability of my family. See, in the gallery, we've probably got a few more tourists than we might normally have on a Saturday because the Smithsonian shut down. I heard from someone who's in the leadership of the Smithsonian who was kind of begging me, saying, those folks who work at the Smithsonian, one level, they may get reimbursed. But all the folks who pick up the trash, clean the bathrooms, serve the cafeteria food, are all contractors. They're not direct employees of the federal workforce. So even when we reopen, even when the federal workforce gets reimbursed, they are out. So one of the things I would hope, and Senator Kaine and I have been working on this, and I'm going to hope the chair will look at this, and I hope some of our other colleagues who want to work towards a solution will work this. In all of the previous shutdowns, we've never, it's complicated, we've never found a way to reimburse contractors. We have a piece of legislation, may not be perfect, but it says for those workers who make less than 50 grand, we ought to find a way to make sure they get reimbursed. And then for those above, some small percentage. Again, if not, these folks will never be made whole. Again, think about some of the tourists. Normally, there's a whole lot of food trucks surrounding the Smithsonian and elsewhere around downtown. We've heard from a number of those folks as well. They can't continue because if the Smithsonian's aren't open, the tourists aren't coming. And if you've taken out a loan to buy a food truck to try to employ a few folks, once that business is shut down, once your loan is pulled, once you lose that truck, even when we come to a solution set, they can't reopen. So I do hope that we will take a look. Again, I know it's unprecedented. We've not looked at federal contractors in the past, but at least for the folks in low and moderate income who cannot make back the 29 days of pay, and Lord knows, if we listen to the president who says he doesn't mind if it's weeks, months, or even years, that we find a way to somehow make them whole. We've also seen small businesses. We have disproportionately in Virginia a lot of small contractor business. Small business owner contractor in Arlington wrote me and said again, quote, my disabled veteran-owned small business will have to shut its door after serving the federal government for the last 2 decades. I'm going to have to put 72 families out of work because our reserves aren't big enough to support the payroll expenses of $35,000 to $40,000 per day during this political impasse. Doesn't take a lot of math to figure out that if you're at roughly 30 days, you're talking about over $1 million in payroll that this small business, veteran-owned small business can't meet. They reopen, no guarantee this business comes back. And it's not just the small businesses who actually serve the government. It is the brewery in Kodiak. It's the restaurant around the battlefields around Richmond, around Senator Kaine's home. Some of the campgrounds that surround the Shenandoah National Park in our Commonwealth. I mean, I think there may be a number of our colleagues who maybe don't have the same concentration that Alaska or Virginia or Maine has, but if they think this problem isn't spreading like a plague, it will come to their states as well. And why do we have to put all these families in our economy through this kind of turmoil? Senator Kaine and I have worked really hard recently, and again, those of us who live in the national capital area, Metro is an important way that we commute. And Metro's had its share of problems the last couple of years. And actually, in a good news story, Virginia, D.C., and Maryland came together and ponied up some more resources so Metro could make some of the improvements and safety improvements and operating improvements to try to improve quality of service for the federal workforce, for tourists in our nation's capital. Every day, every weekday, the federal government is shut down. Metro loses $400,000 in lost fares per day. Metro can't get a break. And where's that money going to rematerialize for? I'm not sure we're going to appropriate millions of additional dollars. Now, at one point, and amongst this debate, we've had debates before, but if there's ever been one that the American public's got a right to be frustrated with, in terms of a shutdown, the historically longest shutdown ever. The President says he wants money for a border wall that he promised the American people was going to be paid for by Mexico. A border wall that says before he'll reopen government, give him $5 billion. I think it's up to almost $5.9 billion. There's some arguments now it's up to $7 or $8 billion. And the truth is, let me be clear, the President or his White House allies are listening. This senator is willing to look at any reasonable investment in additional border security. But it ought to be done in a way where we're not holding these hundreds of thousands of families and literally indirectly millions of Americans hostage. Rule number 101 of hostage taking is you don't not negotiate with a hostage taker. You don't reward a bully. And as I think some of my colleagues on the other side have at least acknowledged privately, if we allow this tactic to work today, it will be back and be reused in April when we've got the debt ceiling. It will be reused at the end of the fiscal year when the next year's appropriations are due. One of the things, again, I hope people of goodwill will also try to see if we can commit to is that we put enough of a poison pill in place that this tactic can never, ever be used again by any Congress or any president without inflicting some damage, frankly, on the legislative branch in the office of the White House. That's part of the remarkable thing. Our offices, and I say to the good folks who work for us in Congress, they're not feeling any of the pain. The White House staff, they're not feeling any of the pain. I do wonder, as the President starts to selectively decide based upon who can lobby him the most about who's going to come back and which gets reopened. And frankly, I'm more than a little disappointed that while it's important that mortgages get processed, that he's decided to bring back certain folks to process mortgages, certain folks in the Agriculture Department to process farmers' loans. They suddenly mysteriously found some money in the State Department to reopen part of the State Department. Love to see that same priority for the folks who process food stamps. But I wonder what kind of federal buildings are going to go into where the toilets aren't cleaned and the trash isn't taken out and the food services aren't provided. But I say to the White House, we will negotiate, we will work through this process. We even said, those of us, and I know the chair's been part of this effort, we'll put it through regular order. We'll consider his proposals in a reasonable way, but let's do it with the government open and people getting paid. Now, in conclusion, I want to thank my friend Senator Kaine from Virginia, because I know, and let me acknowledge also, as somebody that actually lives only 20 minutes away in Virginia, it's a little bit easier for me than being a senator from Alaska or a senator from a host of other places around the country. But I think it is proper and right that we are here today. I think it is proper and right, and I will be back this coming week to try to continue to raise this for us. When we heard from some federal workers that Congress was taking a break for another 10 days when they're supposed to be receiving another pay period and they may get goose eggs and they've got the beginning of February looming where their rents and mortgages and tuition bills are due, I think it is appropriate, and I thank him for forcing us to be back here and continue to raise these issues. Last point I want to make is that I think we owe a huge debt to our federal workers. Federal workers, TSA, air traffic controllers, or the Coast Guard, or for that matter, the folks who process food stamps, or the lady we saw who was supposed to investigate chemical spills, who's desperate to get to Houston where there's been a spill 10 days ago that they still haven't been able to investigate. Because without pay, whether you're furloughed or in many cases being asked to work overtime without pay, they're still showing up. Where they're being asked to commute to work, some from a distance, and as been mentioned by the presiding officer, put a bill on a credit card that's got your name on it and your credit rating at risk. Whether you're a prison guard and you've got to commute an hour and a half in your car and you may not have money for gas, but you're still finding a way to show up for work. Because I wonder, as somebody who worked longer in the private sector than I have in the public sector, how many folks who work in the private sector, if you worked for Facebook or Google, if you worked for Ford or Northrop Grumman, would continue to show up week after week after week without pay? How many folks in the private sector would show up and work overtime without pay and still perform? You know, in a moment, in a kind of straight at the press pool that was with me yesterday at the Arlington Food Bank, I asked all the press folks, and the cameras were off, how many of them would show up tomorrow if they'd gone for 4 or 5 weeks with no end in sight, without any payment? The press was supposed to cover this. There wasn't a single reporter or camera person that didn't at least acknowledge to me, I wish we'd had it all on tape, that no, they wouldn't be showing up in their jobs. So I hope, whether it's those of us as policymakers or candidly our visitors in the gallery, sometimes easy to, you know, and there's been politicians who've made a career out of trashing federal employees. I think it's wrong. I think it's disgraceful. I think now more than ever we owe them a debt of gratitude. And I know that there are at least reports of people at airports and others saying thank you or trying to, you know, slip somebody, food or something else. And the remarkable thing is, because of our rules that in conventional times are appropriate, we can't even in many cases give additional compensation to these federal workers. But we can owe them a personal thanks. And my hope would be a commitment from folks on both sides of the aisle that will think twice before we come down to the floor of this Senate and berate and degrade federal workers going forward. I would hope on a going forward basis, when we get the government reopened, we can find a bipartisan way to actually make sure what this Senate passed in terms of a relatively meager 1.9% federal pay raise increase for this year, that we would override this administration's spiteful executive order trying to take away that pay raise. Because if not, maybe not next week, but the next time this happens, I don't know if those TSA workers will show up. I don't know if those air traffic controllers will keep working. I don't know if those Coast Guard employees will still sign up for service in a place as remote as Kodiak, Alaska. But we have it within our power to end this. If the President of the United States will not end this, we have a bill that is at the desk that 96 of us agreed upon in mid-December, when there wasn't this crisis. Now, when we hear these stories, when we hear this pain, if the president won't act, then the Senate must act and put that legislation on the president's desk and let him choose to not simply postulate, but then make a decision whether he'd sign or veto it. I thank the presiding officer. I know that she and others will be back. Part of the burden of the majority is showing up in that presiding space, and we as the Virginia senators disproportionately had that opportunity during these kind of circumstances. But I hope your stories, from the Senator from Virginia stories, I know the Senator from Maine stories as well, that our other colleagues, that the White House are listening, and that we can find that common agreement to get this government reopened and demonstrate to the workers, the contractors, and the folks who depend upon this federal government that we value their service, and never, ever again will they have to be put through this kind of tragedy. With that, Madam President, I note the absence of a quorum and yield. No, I don't note the absence of a quorum. I refrain from that. I simply yield the floor.
In a Saturday address to the nation, President Trump offered a proposal which, if approved by Congress, would end the government shutdown. His proposal includes